For this purpose, we designed a study where we measured the renin, aldosterone, and the ARR in the early part of the menstrual cycle. This is known as the follicular phase. And once again later in the luteal phase, the later part of the cycle. And these measurements were taken approximately 6 months after giving birth. And then on the basis of this, we compared the results of those who had a history of preeclampsia and those who did not. What were the findings that we took away from this? Firstly, we saw that in both groups they had higher renin and aldosterone levels in the later part of the cycle with a stable ARR. And we saw that women with a history of preeclampsia demonstrated persistently lower values. This is a mouthful what I just said, and so I'll lay it out through my figures. So over here we have a graph for aldosterone on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And we have it broken down based on the controls, the healthy women without a history of preeclampsia and those with a history of preeclampsia. What we saw is that within the controls, the average aldosterone increased in the second half of the of the menstrual cycle. And we saw a similar pattern emerging when we looked at the woman with a history of preeclampsia. But notably, the average aldosterone value for the woman with preeclampsia was lower than that of the woman without a history of preeclampsia. And this was observed as well in the luteal phase. And this trend also emerged when we looked at the renin values, and in turn also emerged when we looked at the ARR itself. An additional important finding that we had was that women with a history of preeclampsia had a more variable ARR value. So for example, when we look at the control group, the luteal and follicular ARRs are fairly closely correlated with each other. However, in the case of women with a history of preeclampsia, it is far more variable. So what can we take from this? First, renin, aldosterone, and ARR is suppressed in women with a history of preeclampsia, and that the ARR is more variable in women with a history of preeclampsia, and therefore extra care should be taken when interpreting the ARR in this population. My fourth study looked at the effects of angiotensin II on hormone levels in women with a history of prior preeclampsia on the basis of these findings that I had. And I sought to determine how an angiotensin II infusion would affect renin, aldosterone, and ARR in this patient population. And they in turn compare the hormonal responses during the follicular and luteal phases of the menstrual cycle. For this purpose, we made controlled clinical measurements of renin, aldosterone, and ARR both before and after an angiotensin II infusion in women with and without a history of preeclampsia. Unfortunately, in this case, our study population of controls was fairly small, and therefore it was hard for us to make a complete assessment between these two groups. The key findings that we took from this was that angiotensin II infusion significantly reduced renin and increased the ARR in both phases. So for example, in this figure, we can see that the renin value both before and after the angiotensin II infusion drops, both in the follicular and luteal phases, while the ARR increases. But perhaps most notably, while aldosterone rose significantly after the infusion in the follicular phase, but not in the luteal phase. So while there was a rise that we did observe, it was not significant and not as great as we would have expected. So, what can we take from this? It seems that it's possible that an alteration in the RAS responsiveness in women exists in those who have a history of preeclampsia. It is also possible that there is an aldosterone ceiling during this luteal phase, preventing aldosterone to rise perhaps as high as we would expect. And finally, there is potentially a long-term RAS system changes in women with a history of preeclampsia. My final study sought to investigate the effects of verapamil, hydralazine, and doxazosin on the ARR. These three medications are very common blood pressure medications that are given and are generally considered to not have a significant effect on the ARR, and in patients where it's impossible to stop these medications prior to screening, these are often continued. However, there is limited empirical evidence of whether or not this is the case, and so we decided to study whether these safe drugs truly do avoid affecting test accuracy. For this purpose, we did a retrospective analysis of 61 patients with high blood pressure. And we compared the aldosterone, renin, and ARR both before and after using hydralazine, doxazosin, and verapamil. And as with all of the studies, these patients were treated in a very controlled environment following strict protocols. This is extremely important when screening for the ARR, as there are a plethora of confounding effects that could be taking place. The key findings that we saw was that hydralazine resulted in a slight increase in renin, no change in aldosterone, but a significantly lowered ARR. In the graph below, you can see that the ARR values for patients prior to treating was typically significantly higher than the treated values after. In the case of doxazosin, we saw a lowered ARR and aldosterone, but minimal effect on renin. And finally, in verapamil, we saw small variable decreases in aldosterone and ARR, but not one which was statistically significant, which in part could be due to the small population size. So, what are the study implications? First, the safe drugs are not entirely neutral and can alter the ARR, and that misinterpretation of the test results could be, and that misinterpretation of the test results could lead to either missed or incorrect screening of primary aldosteronism. I would like to conclude by looking at where I think both research is moving towards. I believe that we should be moving towards establishing universal evidence-based protocols for accurate screening of the ARR. I believe that we need to work harder to address the variability by factoring in key confounders. And I believe that we need further longitudinal studies to understand the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system variations in diverse patient populations. On the practical front, I believe that having more patient-focused approaches leads to improved outcomes by factoring in all aspects of the patient's life. I believe that early interventions reduce the healthcare burden. And my reflections on the path moving forward, I believe that interdisciplinary collaboration drives clinical solutions. Much of the research that I do requires expertise from diverse disciplines and backgrounds. And therefore, I believe that it's important that when we work in this multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary environment, we can make findings and discoveries that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And I believe that personalized medicine will transform hypertension management. Finally, I believe that continued research is vital to enhance screening and treatments for all patients. I would now like to hand over to the Pro-Rector. Thank you.
Thank you for your clear presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Schurgers, Professor of Biochemistry at this university.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, also for you, I have read this thesis with great pleasure. It is a very nice thesis. I learned a lot as a biochemist. You use a lot of biochemical tools to measure renin, aldosterone, and its ratio. You have 7 papers, all published as a first author. My deepest respect for that. And of course, you did that not alone, but together with your colleague and of course your supervision team. So my congratulations to all. So let us start this academic discussion. And it was good that you were a little bit late this morning, so I can start actually with the same question. So you measure these 3 measurements, renin, aldosterone, and its ratio. And then here you have all kind of factors that impact that. It's age and BMI, time of the day, preeclampsia, menstrual cycle, medication, sodium intake, etc. So for that you use these biomarkers. And the term biomarker is a portmanteau of biological marker. So my first question is, what is in your opinion a good biological marker?
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I think it's an extremely important one that we should be addressing. Biological markers or biomarkers, typically what you're looking for is that they are functioning as a proxy for some other thing that we want to look at. This is very frequently the case that sometimes the thing that we actually want to measure is difficult either because it's prohibitively expensive or a whole variety of other factors. And so biomarkers can act as a substitute in that case. So therefore, I think that the first and most important thing for a biomarker is that it needs to act as a good substitute for what we're looking at. In the case of something like the aldosterone-to-renin ratio, it is an acceptable biomarker in that it does give indications of what is happening within the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. But due to the high level of confounding factors, that does act as, something that makes it much harder to say that this is unequivocally.
I fully agree with
Yeah.
you. So there are many factors influencing this ratio and also these two biomarkers. What is, in your case, the factor that most impacts renin, aldosterone, and its ratio? Because you have, throughout your whole thesis, mentioned a lot of these confounding or risk factors. Which is the most important one?
And thank you very much for the question. And that is an extremely difficult one to answer as well. In the case of when we're looking at the ARR, there are just so many factors, and they all typically are interacting with each other at the same time, that it can be a situation where a factor that might not necessarily be considered so major could be acting synergistically with a different factor that's causing a much outsized result than we would expect. I think, while perhaps not the most important factor, I think perhaps notably is just the sheer variability of the ARR. As pointed out in my study looking at the variability, we could see that merely taking the measurement 2 hours later could result in significant shifts in the ARR. And when we're dealing with a ratio that is liable to so much variability, when, to the best of our knowledge, all other potential confounding factors are controlled for, that's perhaps very concerning.
And actually, I'm very happy with this answer, because now I can go to my next question. Okay. So you proposed to measure 2 measurements instead of 1, because that is more reliable. Now, if you measure a marker twice and you have the same value, it can be twice a good value. It can also be twice the wrong value, or if one is different from the other, you don't know what is the good value. So my colleague from the clinical chemistry, he mentioned he has only 300 measurements a year. So I think we can increase that. What would be, in your case, a good number? How many repeats should we measure in these markers to have a reliable value?
Thank you very much for the question. It sounds perhaps like a cop-out, but I would say it depends. Obviously there is a big factor where a patient could have a fairly extreme value, and then we take a second value, and there will be a sort of regression to the mean that we're seeing, and that could then give us a clear idea of, what is the typical ARR for this patient. That being said, a big issue that we have is that I don't believe that all patients necessarily need this. If we're seeing a patient who has an extremely low ARR, I do not believe that there is necessarily much clinical utility to doing a repeat measurement.
So you don't believe in false negative results?
I do believe in false negative results, but I do believe that if we're looking at the patient, as I mentioned in my conclusion slide, that we should be taking a more holistic approach when we're looking at, what is the a priori chance of a patient having PA. If there's a very high index of clinical suspicion, then I believe if we're seeing a result that doesn't fit that, then, and it's perhaps entering a sort of borderline region of the ARR where it could, it's not quite elevated, but it's also not low either. I definitely think that patient population is appropriate for those screening measures.
But for example, in your study, you use 2 time points. One is on the same day, one is 1 year later.
Yes.
Do you think it's the right time points chosen? Because in the first, let's say in the same day, you see something like 11% differences, and after 1 year, even up to 30% differences in the value. Which time frame should we measure if we have multiple time points? If you would, let's say, standardize this, include this in clinical care.
Yes, well, I would begin by saying that I think that the 1 year time point that was used is not one that I would necessarily recommend in clinical practice. If you're dealing with a patient with resistant hypertension, that they're on multiple antihypertensives and we're not seeing sufficient response from that, I don't think that's a good idea to, and you have a high index of suspicion for PA, I don't think it's the right choice to wait a whole year before you're going to be doing a follow-up screening. I think probably it makes sense to do it relatively soon, perhaps not necessarily on the same day, because that could lead to excessive screening where you barely even know the first result and you've already planned everything, and that will rise up costs unnecessarily. But I think certainly within the coming days, if the first result was not what we would expect based on the clinical presentation.
So we need a lot of disciplines working together to really find an answer to this. Mr. Prorector, can I still ask a short question? Can one of the paronyms read proposition number 2?
Contrary to previous assumptions, veromeptin, hydralazine, doxazosin exhibit significant and varying effects on the aldosterone-to-renin ratio, potentially leading to misdiagnoses in primary aldosteronism screening and highlighting the need for medication-specific considerations in endocrine testing. This thesis.
Thank you, and sorry for forcing you to read this very long, difficult sentence. So, I was really intrigued because medication can have an effect. And why do you only take into account medications that are hypertensive drugs? Do you or can you think of medications that can have an impact on renin or aldosterone that have nothing to do with hypertension?
Certainly. Before I answer my question, I'd like to thank my colleague who is a computer scientist by trade. It was very impressive how he pronounced those medication names. I absolutely believe that there's a wide variety of medicines that could have this effect. In general, the focus typically is on hypertensive medications. This is for a variety of reasons. Firstly, these patients that we're screening, they have high blood pressure. That's why they're there in the first place. So these are arguably the medications that they're most likely already to be on. Though, of course, they could be on any other medications for other conditions that they may have. The second reason is that there is, at least from
but I think it's based on the time, because I think the prorector will soon stop this discussion. Can you come up with a drug that has nothing to do with a hypertensive drug but could interfere?
A hypertensive drug that could interfere?
No, that has nothing to do with hypertension. So a drug unrelated to hypertension.
I think almost any drug could potentially have an effect. You know, the hormonal system is deeply interconnected with each other, and there's so many knock-on effects that could happen. You know, based on frequency of the drug use, I think we warrant further investigations.
So there could be another few chapters added to the thesis. Thank you very much for your answers, and I give the word back to Mr. Prorector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Bekers, Professor of Clinical Chemistry at this university.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, first of all, I want to give you my compliments for your thesis. Very interesting. I've learned a lot, and also want to thank and compliment the two promoters of your work. I'm a clinical chemist, and in our laboratory we use reference ranges, and you are an expert in this field, so I want to ask you if you want to give comments on our reference value, and our reference value are for aldosterone 100 to 860 picomole per liter, for renin 4 to 60 milliunits per liter, and the R ratio lower than 31 picomole per milliunits per liter. What do you think of that values, and do you think how are the best values, and how we probably can make better values?
A highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the question. I think that those values are perfectly acceptable. I think that there isn't likely to be a sort of one-size-fits-all value, especially when we're using current techniques for assessing these values. If we move into a world where we're doing more mass spectrometry-based investigations, we could have it that's more standardized, but I think typically biochemical labs need to make those reference ranges somewhat according to their own discretion of what they're seeing within their patient population. So I do not see any issue with those values.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that those values are suitable for all patients?
I think that it depends on the patient presentation. I think that reference values only give you a small slice of the picture. It's like one piece in a puzzle, but there's a much larger puzzle in place. So you could have it that a patient has a slightly lower renin than the reference range, but if they have normal blood pressure, if they have aldosterone in an acceptable range, that's not inherently an indication that there's something going wrong within the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Reference ranges are reference ranges, they're for reference, and I advise great caution in a clinician who just looks at those reference ranges and uses that as the exclusive basis for determining if something is abnormal or normal.
Yeah, because pre-analytical factors also, I think, are very important in that case.
Could you repeat the question?
Pre-analytical conditions are also important, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that speaks to the issue that we have with the ARR, where there are so many confounding factors, be it sodium intake of the patient. I mean, they could have just had a fish and chips with lots of salt on the night before, and who knows what effect that could have. I mean, that's just one example that is off the top of my head. But you know, that also is a factor that needs to be considered when we're looking at these reference ranges, is we need to be actually looking at what medications is the patient on, what's the lifestyle of the patient, all of these other factors that can be playing a role.
Is it an idea to measure it when people are not ill? Before you never know when they get ill, but when everybody knows his ERR, they have a reference range for each person.
You could potentially do something along those lines. I mean, I feel like that falls into the category of if you're doing tests when there's no medical indication for them, can be a very concerning thing to do. It's for like as slightly tangential, but you know, people who are in perfect health and then they go for their they pay out of pocket to have a full body MRI scan. You know, very often incidentalomas and who knows what else is found, and that then warrants further investigation. But these things would have never been found otherwise. These things would have never have caused problems for the patient's lives. It causes both a great deal of emotional distress to the patient when something unexpected comes out, and it's also a very large burden on the healthcare system.
I fully agree with you.
Yeah, very good.
My next question is about chapter 6. You've studied the diurnal variation of the IR ratio, a very interesting study. I have a little bit things you call APRC. I would prefer to call that APRA. Have you any idea? I'm a clinogamist. I always look to abbreviations and to concentrations. Have you any idea why I would change that in APRA? It's a bit clinical chemistry question, but maybe you know it.
It's a very good question, and admittedly, it is somewhat out of my depth to give that answer. To my understanding, I believe that there is some variability in the terminology that gets used, where we do have multiple terms that typically refer to roughly equivalent techniques and values.
The C stands for concentration, but you measure activities. So I would prefer to place the C not there, but an E. But that's a detail. In figure 6.2 on page 101, you compare an older group with a younger group, and the older group with a median age of 56. In my opinion, it's not so old, but it's a personal remark. With a young group of 39, and my question is, when you started this study, do you expect these results that you have shown in figure 6.2?
Dear esteemed colleague, thank you very much for the question. On the one hand, when you're asking me if we expected those results, like as a good scientist, you should be going in with a null hypothesis and therefore not actually expecting any effect to be observed.
In chapter 4, you have also studied this, so yes. Maybe you had an idea.
I think that it is reasonable to expect that there would be changes that happen within the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system throughout the patient's life. Everything is held within a pretty tight homeostasis, but typically when certain aspects of the blood pressure regulatory system, which has multiple levers, start changing, you can see changes then happening within the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to expect to see how that is functioning to be changing as a patient ages.
And you've looked, I've not found it to the differences in gender in the chapter. You have not done that?
No. In the case of differences in gender, to the best of my recollection, I do not believe that there were significant differences that were found between those two groups. This was, I believe, looking at women who were postmenopausal, and therefore I think a lot of the hormonal, as was mentioned in the previous question, how you have this interplay of many hormonal systems. You know, when you don't have the menstrual cycle with the various hormones that come along with that, you can expect, in the case of women, and men for the results for the way that the RAS is impacted between men and women to be roughly equivalent going forward.
Okay, I thank you for your answers, and I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Dijnem, internist at the Radboud UMC in Nijmegen. Thank you for coming to Maastricht, the oldest city of the Netherlands.
No, that's Nijmegen, I think. Thank you very much. Dear candidate, my congratulations with this unique achievement, beautiful book, and also together with someone else who's not been always at the same spot as you were, so that's even more admirable. I would like to add something which is not in your thesis, which is the actual patients with primary aldosteronism. What would you consider to be the basic feature of these patients?
Thank you very much for the kind words, highly esteemed opponent, and thank you for the question. It is a very heterogeneous population group from that point of view. When we look into the past, we always used to say that the primary thing we see is hypokalemia, that is kind of pathognomonic for PA, and these days we don't see it that way anymore.
Yeah, that's one of the manifestations of, but what is the basic problem in what happens? Why would we call it primary aldosteronism?
It's a situation in which we have it that aldosterone is being secreted inappropriately relative to the other homeostatic mechanisms that should be at play in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system.
Yeah, and how do you then define this autonomy? What's the sign in all the results that you obtain as a clinician that makes you think it is an autonomous aldosterone secretion?
Well, typically the first thing we'd be looking at is, as I mentioned, the entire topic is the aldosterone-to-renin ratio. If we're seeing that renin is inappropriately low relative to the aldosterone value, we're seeing high blood pressure levels, indicating that somewhere the system is going wrong, and aldosterone just simply should not be this high given the clinical presentation. That would be the primary thing that we're seeing.
Well, one of the things that is so striking in this disease is that not only in the primary hypertensive patient, but also in the patients with primary aldosteronism, there is this high variability. And so this is why you propose, I guess, to do multiple measurements, which is costly and takes a lot of effort. Would it be, and we don't know why this variability occurs, but what solution could you imagine for of getting rid of this variability in the aldosterone levels? Do you have any idea of that?
I mean, that's an excellent question, and I think...
Thank you.
The simple answer is that I think that a great degree of that variability is unavoidable. I think that most importantly, we should be working on standardizing procedures, because greater standardization means that we can control for that variability. But as pointed out in my study, where we were looking at patients who ostensibly had the exact same conditions for both measurements, arguably, you could say there might have been a slight circadian effect, because a little bit late, when you had the same day measurements a little bit late, they were having the second measurement a little bit late in the day, so there could be some effects from that. But yeah, there was a significant change that we were seeing. And so I think my answer harkens back to what I already said before, where I think that we need to be very holistic looking at the patient presentation.
There's an initiative with clinical chemists in the Netherlands to find out whether the 24-hour collections as a sort of integral of the aldosterone production be used as the screening test for primary aldosteronism. What do you think of this idea?
I think that is a very feasible thing to do. I mean, that reminds me a little bit of generally how we use it when we're doing like a saline load confirmatory test, where we're trying to increase the sodium intake and then seeing what are the aldosterone levels in the urine over a 24-hour period after that. I think that it is something worth considering, but it is also something that can potentially be burdensome with lower levels of patient compliance. If it's being done on an outpatient basis, I think patient compliance is perhaps a little bit uncertain, and if we're doing on an inpatient basis, that's then also very cumbersome. But perhaps most importantly, I believe that we'd then only be looking at aldosterone and not at renin, and I think that that doesn't necessarily give us a full picture.
Yeah, but we could do the renin first, and at least since it is considered a low renin state, that only in the patients with low renin then would follow. Going back to these primary aldosteronism patients that are still absent from your thesis, now we will integrate these patients with the primary hypertensive patients, so we will have an undiagnosed general population of hypertensive patients. Have you been thinking, because you say continued research is vital to enhance screening and treatments, what kind of research would you do with this undiagnosed group of patients to find out how you can make the distinction between primary hypertension and primary aldosteronism?
I think that there's a variety of studies that we could do for that purpose. In general, I find that the quality of research that has been done in the past has been spotty at best. There's very poor standardization. I think future studies, we need to have greater standardization. I think when we're looking at factors that we should be considering, I think almost everything is on the table, but I think greater research on the effects of antihypertensives is perhaps a great starting point, given that these patient populations are typically on these medications and it's often infeasible to withdraw them prior to screening. And I think another issue that we have is that we generally work with very narrow patient populations. And you know, for example, we know that within African Americans, the renin-angiotensin system functions a fair bit differently with regards to how, on the basis of how they respond to various medications. And in that population group, for example, there's functionally no research that's being done. And so there's many directions that we can go down for the research. I think it's
the problem is that we have a great difficulty in diagnosing these patients precisely. For instance, the saline infusion test is a rather crappy test, I must say. So how would you then propose to define your gold standard for the diagnosis?
Well, there are several methods that are currently put in place. I think, if I recall correctly, the fluticasone test is the current gold standard, but that is debatable and also very cumbersome to perform. What I would say is we got to make do with what's available, like be it the Caterpillar test, saline infusion, but also what I think should be kept in mind is that for patients where they have extremely high levels of clinical suspicion for PA, and you know, the ARR is in alignment with our expectations, it may not be even necessary at that point to go on to confirmatory testing. We could potentially go straight into adrenal venous sampling, for example, and trying to look into treatment.
Okay, thank you very much. I think my time is up.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Spiering, internist at the UMC Utrecht. Thank you for joining via the World Wide Web.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, I'd like to echo my compliments to you, your co-candidate, and your promotion team for this excellent thesis, and I'm looking forward for the discussion. I would like to start with discussing Chapter 11. And my question is that a few aspects of the measurement of the ARR were different than recommended in the guideline, the current guideline, regarding sampling in the supine position and collecting samples under cooled conditions. What was the reason for you to deviate from the guideline recommended sampling after being up for at least 2 hours and sitting 5 to 10 minutes? And how may this have impacted your results?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the question. It is true that we deviated from the current guidelines, as you pointed out. The reasons for this choice were manifold. The first reason I'd like to give is that there has been previous research that's been done that found that when in a supine position there was a lower degree of variability within the aldosterone-to-renin ratio. There was a high degree of, well, I suppose I shouldn't say variability, actually there's a high degree of precision in that case. So I think for research settings it is sensible to make this an option. I don't think it really works against the research. The second aspect is that also a practical consideration in our case, where much of the data that we were working was collected prior to the standardization of those guidelines, and therefore we were working simply within the constraints of the data that we had available to us.
Okay, thank you. But if I may interrupt, because you really like to stress in your thesis that standardization is very important, and now you decide that you will deviate from the guideline. Also regarding sampling under cooling conditions, at least the guideline recommends sampling at room temperature, but you decided not to do this. And we had earlier this discussion on plasmarenin activity and PRA, but how may have this impact your results?
Very much for the question. Please continue.
No, you understand my question?
I believe so. I think, yeah. I mean, first off, I completely agree that is an inconsistency within both my vision for the future when we're doing testing and the research that I personally did, where much of that data was done in a way that's not considered standard by current practices. And that's also part of the reason why I think that this is a field that I would like to continue doing more research in, and to actually start doing more research with modern standardization approaches. With regards to the protocol with the cooling, it is true that you can have it that the PRA is overstated when there's cooling, because there's a possibility that some of that pro-renin can be become active. That being said, if I recall correctly, in the methods of how we approached it, we found that the lab itself had very low levels of variability of the renin values with their benchmarks, and therefore, in the case of this study in particular, I believe that it was done in a sufficiently standardized manner, and we had sufficiently low historical records of variability of the renin that I do think that the results are valid. I don't think that it's likely that renin was vastly overstated.
Yeah, and I also think that the cryoactivation potentially has major impact on the PRA, which you did not measure, but less on the direct renin concentration that you measured. So I agree there that this may not have had major impact on your results. Then you did a very nice study where you compared 3 drugs that are now currently recommended in the guideline to use as escape drugs during testing. And one of the drugs is verapamil, slow release, which is a non-dihydropyridine calcium antagonist. And the same is for verapamil. You did not test this, but this is more or less used commonly, so you can choose for diltiazem or verapamil. But do you think that your results based on verapamil can be extrapolated to diltiazem?
Thank you very much for the question. I am... On the one hand, I'd say there's a possibility that can be extrapolated. On the other hand, clearly, even on the basis of the research that I've already done, it's risky to make assumptions that we can extrapolate findings, or just based on thinking, oh, there's maybe a similar mechanism of action at play here. It's unlikely that there's going to be a different effect. That was the basis that these guidelines were built on, where they're saying that we can use these medications as escape drugs, and we're finding that that's not necessarily the case on the basis of the research that I presented here. I would say tentatively we could perhaps extrapolate it, but ideally it should be studied individually.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not a pharmacologist, but if you just look at the molecular structure of these 2 drugs, they are quite different. So I don't think you can easily extrapolate that. Having said that, and I hope I have time, Mr. Prorector, for my final question. Having learned from...
Only if we get a short answer, otherwise we have to continue to another opponent. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
My very short question is, what do you recommend? Should we test for PA without any drugs at all?
Ideally, yes, but that is obviously not always possible, and we should then be, when not possible, doing our best to take that into account.
I thank you for the discussion and give the word back to the Prorector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dinan, Professor of Family Medicine at this university.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, well, also my congratulations with an excellent piece of scientific work. Nicely published, very nicely, and a very clinically relevant subject. Now, from this clinical point of view, I was wondering, in particular in primary care, that's where I work, so where GPs and family doctors do their job every day. Diagnosing and treating hypertension is almost a daily business. I think, in fact, it is a daily business. Mm-hmm. Now, knowing this, what do you think about adding some kind of a point-of-care test for ARR in primary care? Does it make sense?
Highly esteemed point. Thank you very much for the question. I think that there is potentially room for that, but I would advise caution. My reasoning behind that is, in general, whenever we're talking about the ARR, these are patients that have been referred through to a secondary or tertiary care setting exactly because there was a high index of clinical suspicion for primary aldosteronism in the first place. So when we're looking at things like the positive predictive value and negative predictive value, that is on the basis of patients with a very high a priori chance of having primary aldosteronism. And so while I think, given that the ARR is a relatively cheap test to do and can be of some clinical value, I think that some caution needs to be considered that, it can alter that how useful we think it is. Like potentially then we should consider making it that we have a higher cutoff, but then potentially lots of patients that in a tertiary setting would have been considered as having a high ARR suddenly now fall below the threshold. And so it introduces those complexities, and I think especially in the context where you have a family medicine doctor having to sort of deal with the full spectrum of medicine, there's often you need a very nuanced view and expertise within this very narrow subject to kind of piece everything together to come to, putting it all together. Like I said, the ARR is not a straightforward thing. So
I agree. You're explaining me very carefully that we must be careful, which is a good thing, I would say. It also reflects on every doctor and being active in medicine, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's also not an emergency thing, probably. Mm-hmm. Okay, now let's say that there is an industry and let's say a little bit less careful and simply does introduce the test, the point-of-care test. Why not? Because they think, well, we can earn money. Mm-hmm. Do you think that in the hands of a primary care doctor, such a test will be less or more reliable than in the hands of hospital doctors?
It depends. I think it is highly dependent on... I think that it is highly dependent on... Excuse me, I lost my train of thought for a second. I think that it is dependent on the knowledge and skills and expertise of the primary care physician.
They're doing point-of-care tests every day.
Of course.
Different kinds.
Maybe
that's helpful.
In principle, I think it should be possible. I don't immediately see a reason why that couldn't be the case. And certainly there would be benefits regarding identifying patients with PA that might have fallen through the cracks otherwise if it required
what do you think about doing a study on the reliability of such a test in primary care?
I think that would be a fantastic study to do. Okay. And
well, just let me know if you're that far. Then ring the bell, please. Yeah.
I'll be
Okay.
in
Then
contact.
the final question is about proposition 8. So maybe I can ask your AI good friend again. This time the text is not as difficult as you just read.
Number 8 was? The application of AI in medical imaging and pathology heralds a new era of diagnostic precision, but its widespread adoption requires the establishment of standardized validation protocols and ethical guidelines to ensure equitable and reliable deployment across diverse patient populations and healthcare settings.
Excellent, thank you very much. Now my question is, what do you think about inviting, starting today, why not, inviting every patient planning to see his or her doctor to first of all do a bit of homework, which will be checking ChatGPT or maybe even Evidence Hunt before going to the hospital or the other doctors?
Just to make sure that I understand your question, that the patient themselves is using ChatGPT?
Yeah.
I'm in strong support of putting a patient in the driving seat of making responsible decisions for their own healthcare, but I would caution against the patient using Dr. ChatGPT to...
But why? I mean, I'm from the time that there was only paper. Internet did not exist yet.
Well, I mean...
And then we were so afraid that our patients would go wrong once checking the internet. They don't.
I mean, I think that for patients, it's the issue with the technology has come into a factor of that these models are not fully reliable. There are many. I mean, at the end of the day, in very, very blunt terms, ChatGPT is an extremely advanced, prediction tool for words. You know, like when you have your phone and you see the suggested word that comes next. ChatGPT is just a very, very powerful version of that. And therefore, it is also liable to very often make mistakes, very often hallucinate, very often give incorrect information. And perhaps more concerning, especially with ChatGPT, we don't know the data that it was trained on. We don't really have a good understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. We don't know the patient populations that they fed studies into it. No. It is an extremely risky proposition to sort of hand over that level of trust to something that we have very poor
So it's just like something with Wikipedia.
Well, I mean, that comes with its own set of issues. You made use of Wikipedia earlier to do
I did, yeah.
But
it was very helpful.
I'm sure it was very helpful, but you also had the benefit of having a fairly deep understanding of medicine and biology in general running up to that, which allowed you to perhaps be more critical in assessing what you're reading. I'm all in support of patients educating themselves and knowing more. But it should probably be in taking approach of doctors and patients working collaboratively with one another, rather than one trying to take the reins over the other.
I think we agree. Thank you very much for your answers, and I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor De May, Professor of Pharmacology at this university.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, congratulations. This work is baie goed.
Baie dankie.
And in this collaboration, in this congratulation, I would like to include your colleague and especially also your supervisors. And in my attempt to stimulate and contribute to interdisciplinary collaboration, I would like your paranymph to read Proposition 1, if possible.
You can do this.
The marked variability of aldosterone-to-renin ratio observed in both short-term and long-term measurements challenges the reliability of single-point assessments for predicting primary aldosteronism in hypertensive patients, necessitating a re-evaluation of current diagnostic protocols. This thesis.
That sounds like a very short summary of a lot of work, a lot of beautiful work, but it also sounds a bit negative and a bit depressing. What can be done to improve the value of these measurements? And your work and your discussions, they made me very curious. And especially in chapter 6, when you try to understand how these values change during the day, you had to include another system that affects at least aldosterone secretion, ACTH. Would the inclusion of this pituitary-derived hormone that acts on the adrenal gland, would that help in understanding the variability or reducing the variability of your measures to the benefit of the diagnosis of primary aldosteronism?
Highly esteemed colleague, thank you very much for your question. I mean, initially I would first say I don't believe that it would necessarily reduce the variability of the ARR itself. The variability is what it is. I do see the value of taking ACTH into account, though perhaps more in the context of confirmatory testing and greater, once we've determined more that there's a primary aldosteronism. The reason for me saying this is I believe that, you know, in recent years we've got a greater understanding of the various types of familial primary aldosteronism, and I believe that we have found that one of the types is very strongly linked to how the ROS responds to ACTH, and so in that patient population it could potentially be useful to have a better understanding of how that interplay happens. So I certainly see value in knowing more. I'm uncertain though if that's going to necessarily result in decreased variability, but it does add an added piece to the puzzle for us to perhaps more give a more nuanced assessment of what that AOR in a given patient could potentially mean.
Thank you. But as the pro-rector mentioned, I'm a pharmacologist. So my attention was particularly drawn to chapter 11 that was already discussed here in the opposition. And I noted that 3 drugs that are routinely used in antihypertensive treatment, hydralazine, doxazosine, and verapamil, had quite different effects on the ARR. And then in your discussion you say, well, hydralazine, this one I understand. That's a vasodilator, so it will increase sympathetic drive, more beta adrenoceptor stimulation on the adrenal gland. Okay, this one I understand. But to the best of my knowledge, doxazosine, an alpha-1 antagonist, also causes vasodilatation. And then verapamil, among others, also acts as a vasodilator. And they either have no effect or they have an opposite effect. So do you really understand the effect of hydralazine?
I would say that my answer would have to be very nuanced, but I don't think that we necessarily have a clear idea of the effect of hydralazine, or you know, that's the case for many of the medications that we've looked at. What our findings are primarily built around is that we are seeing empirical evidence that, you know, these are the values that we're getting before, these are the values that we're getting after, this is the change that we're observing. We can then go into further, you know, more nitty-gritty studies looking at from a mechanistic point of view. But
you may finalize your answer. Short answer.
Very short. I think it's something that's worth looking in deeper. I think that the empirical findings point to a need for further research to understand those more fine and nuanced aspects of the pharmacology going on underneath.
Thank you. I find your answers satisfactory. Thank you.
Thank you. Gregory Veldhuizen, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Gregory Veldhuizen, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense today. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor de Leeuw is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please all rise.
You first have to take the declaration of scientific integrity. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
I promise.
Thank you. By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Gregory Patrick Veldhuizen, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dear Gregory, or should I now respectfully say Dr. Veldhuizen, let me begin by congratulating you with the doctorate that you have just obtained, and of course I also want to extend the felicitations to your family, your parents and everyone who can follow this ceremony through the internet or whatever for artificial intelligence systems we could think of. You have accomplished a tremendous work together with Rawan over the past years. And I remember very well how we first met. It was at the Zuiderland Medical Center, where I was doing bedside teaching with students in the Department of Internal Medicine there. And that were groups of 4 to 5 co-assistenten who were to follow 2 of those bedside sessions. But not you. You had done 2 and you wanted to do more. So that is illustrative of your desire to learn and want to know more than everybody else, even though there was no need to, because already at that time you impressed me very much by your skills and abilities to take a history and do a physical exam, which was already at the time much better than what your fellow students displayed. Well, because of that extra lesson that you wanted to take, we came to talk, and it soon became clear. I don't know exactly how the talks went on, but at a certain moment you expressed the desire to do research. And of course, since I was the only one in the room who could help a little bit with that, you ended up by me. I hope this was not a disappointment for you. And then it also became clear to me that you were from South Africa, which was also interesting to me. I've been to South Africa several times and even have friends from South Africa. So that also established some kind of bond. And at that time, I carefully hinted already a bit to a PhD project, which you immediately embraced because you wanted to obtain a PhD as quickly as possible. So you wanted to work with us, but of course, since I was retired already, I had to consult your co-supervisor, Bram Kroon. but he was immediately enthusiastic as well. So we incorporated you and Rawan in our department, and you were working on this aldosterone-to-renin ratio topic. In fact, and I mentioned that already this morning to Rawan, I gave you a list of 10 topics, and I can say frankly and honestly here and now that I had sincerely hoped that you had picked up another topic because I was not quite sure whether we could accomplish a complete thesis. But as I told Rawan this morning as well, the two of you showed that it was entirely possible. And you started out with the data, you went to my attic, you went to my garden, we did all kinds of things. We discussed it in Bunde, we discussed it in Milan, at several places in the world. And thanks to the grant by CAREM, we could keep you for the research because we had a competition. At the same time, there was a cardiologist who sincerely wanted you to have you in his department and do cardiology work. So this was a competition, but you chose for us, and I think it was an excellent choice. You also had the 2 papers in the Journal of Clinical Hypertension, the first 2 papers, first journal accepted. Tremendous achievement, of course, already at the time that you were still a student and not really a PhD student. Usually, at a point of this, you look a little bit back and you look at some mishaps of the person who has received the doctorate and some crazy things that he did. And I thought, and I couldn't come up with anything. You are such a serious person, and you are broadly acting. You know, when we discussed the thesis and the defense that you did, we talk to each other, and everybody says what he thought of it. That's of course secret. So I can't tell you anything more. But I wanted to, I want to breach this for one time and say that one of the members of the committee found you an actor, someone who could on stage immediately impress the public, and that's indeed what you do, and that's also what I remember from you and the way how you also presented your data at the international congresses. Now you are a bright man. You demonstrated that today. I saw in your CV that you are also a polyglot. You even speak Arabic, I saw, so you can communicate with everyone. Better probably than I did this morning. And of course, for such a man, Maastricht is too small. So you went out to Aachen and Dresden, and now you even go to the United States. You're also an adept of Stoicism, we read in your propositions. Now, when you go to the United States, you have to be very stoic. Mm-hmm. Some things you cannot change. You can't change that Trump is president. So don't put any effort in that. But what you can do is change medicine there. And with your ability, your skills, and your academic institution, you are able to make the difference in the United States where you're going to work. And I wish you all the best with your further career. En tenslotte wil ik nog voor jou iets in Afrikaans zeggen. En dit is dat jij mij door de jaren baie beïndruk hebt met jouw doorzettingsvermogen, jouw dikelijkheid en jouw scherp wetenschappelijke ingesteldheid. Ik wens jou alles van die beste toe met jouw toekomstige navorsing en werk. Baie dankie. Ik heb gezegd.
Baie dankie vir die baie mooie woorde.
Dear Dr. Veldhuizen, I also want to congratulate you, and I can do that also on behalf of the whole university community for Maastricht University. I wish to give the floor to Dr. Spiering for a few words.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, my compliments for a great defense. We had a very good discussion. I liked this very much, and I really wish you the best and enjoy this great day. Thank you.
Thank you. And with this, I close this academic ceremony.